The days had long since begun to dissolve into each other, shapeless and indistinct, like ink bleeding through damp paper. He would wake to the sound of nothing. No birds, no morning traffic, no human voices carried through thin apartment walls. Just the mechanical hum of the smart thermostat, the dull click of his computer waking before he did, the slow inhale of the city's dying breath. He would check his messages out of habit, though he already knew there was nothing waiting for him. No unread emails, no missed calls, no invitations. His inbox was filled with corporate updates from companies he hadn't shopped from in years, automated warnings about the state of the environment, news alerts that repeated the same tragedies with minor variations. At work, he ran simulations predicting ecological collapse. Yet he had ceased believing in the utility of his research. No longer stirred even the smallest flicker of urgency. Lunch was always the same. He would sit at his desk with a protein bar and a plastic bottle of synthetic nutrients, staring at reports detailing the nutritional deficiencies of future generations. The irony no longer amused him. The evenings stretched before him like a blank expanse. He would walk through the city's empty streets, past shuttered cafes and neon signs advertising products that no one could afford. The few people he passed did not look at him, their faces illuminated by the dull glow of their screens. A civilization reduced to ghosts haunting their own ruins. And always the same thought gnawed at him. What does it matter? What did it matter if he submitted another report? What did it matter if the glaciers melted, if the air turned toxic, if the world shrank until there was nothing left but wasteland and memory? He had dedicated his life to a cause that no longer had an audience. Even the warnings had become background noise, another layer of data absorbed and ignored. Drought, population decline, forests would wither, cities would drown, economies would fail. The world would continue, reduced to something smaller, meaner, lonelier. He felt like a doctor studying the pulse of a corpse, recording each moment of decay with meticulous indifference. The headlines had lost their sting. They were no longer warnings, but confirmations. The world was ending, not in fire or thunder, but in quiet inertia. He had always felt it, though for most of his life he had managed to ignore it. It wasn't a voice. Voices could be argued with, dismissed, drowned out by the trivial noise of existence. No, this was something quieter, more insidious. A pressure beneath the skin, a sensation just at the edge of perception, like a door that had been left ajar in a house he didn't remember entering. He had spent years pretending not to notice it. There had always been reasons, practical, reasonable, even noble reasons, not to step through that door. A career, stability, the reassuring weight of a salary deposited at predictable intervals. The world was already falling apart. Wasn't it enough that he was trying, in his small and methodical way, to hold back the tide? He had convinced himself that the emptiness he felt was simply a byproduct of intelligence, of rationality. that those who sought meaning in grand gestures were only running from their own insignificance. And yet, at night, when the distractions had quieted, when the glow of his computer screen no longer cast its cold light over his thoughts, he could feel it pressing against him, the knowledge that he was meant for something else. Perhaps not in the way of myths, not in the way of heroes whose paths were laid before them in burning letters across the sky. It was more subtle than that, a discomfort, an awareness that this life he was living was not his own, but a compromise, a version of himself that had settled, that had chosen safety over purpose. But what was purpose, and who in his age had the luxury of chasing it? The answer should have been simple: no one. What if you fail? That had always been the whisper beneath his thoughts, the thing that held him back every time he stood at the edge of something unknown. He had seen men and women who had tried, who had leapt into the abyss only to find it endless. He had watched brilliant minds fade into obscurity, their passions reduced to unpayable debts, their ambitions sacrificed to a world that had no place for them. He had told himself he was different, that he wasn't afraid, only wise, that the world was not kind to those who sought out dragons where others saw only mist. But now he knew better. It wasn't wisdom that had kept him in place, nor reason, nor pragmatism. It was the same thing that had kept every man in every age from crossing the threshold when they had heard the call: fear. At home, standing before the mirror, the fluorescent light buzzing overhead, casting deep shadows beneath his eyes, he traced his reflection with his eyes, searching for the man he had always imagined he would become. And he didn't find him. He looked like a man fading from existence. For years, he'd believed that this battle was external, that the only war worth fighting was the one that could be measured in numbers, in carbon levels and policy changes, in the tangible, the calculable. But he saw now that before any of that, there was another war, a deeper one, and he was losing it. He turned on the faucet, let the water run, and placed his hand beneath the stream. It was colder than it should have been. In bed, already halfway gone, he saw the pattern for the second time. The first time he saw it, he had dismissed it as a trick of light on the screen. A flicker, a shimmer, an error in the feed of endless data streams that coursed through his monitor like a river swollen with melting ice. He had been working late at the Environmental Research Center, his eyes dry from the artificial glow, his fingers tracing lines of climate models that always ended in catastrophe. But now it had happened again, and this time he knew it was no accident. He got out of bed and ran the numbers again, stripping the layers of abstraction. The pattern didn't belong to the elegant chaos of ecological mathematics, nor did it conform to the frantic logic of algorithms predicting the collapse of the polar caps. Like a vast submerged skeleton lay a sequence older than the machines that processed it. An ancient rhythm, a repetition so perfect it seemed carved from the marrow of the world itself. a spiral, coiling, shifting, a self-consuming shape hidden in the numbers. Deliberate, recursive, tightening like a noose. A shape that shouldn't have been there. He had seen it before. Not in the lines of code flickering on his monitor, not in the sterile glow of climate models that whispered the world's doom, but somewhere older, buried beneath the detritus of his own life. The memory surfaced without warning, rising like a long-submerged wreck breaking through the tide. He had been a child, no older than 9, when he first glimpsed it. It was summer, and the days stretched long and golden, though they seemed heavier now in recollection, their light thick and feverish, like honey left too long in the sun. It had been in his grandfather's library, a place of dust and whispered pages, where the air smelled of ink and time. His grandfather had been a collector of strange and forgotten books, tomes filled with symbols and diagrams that his young mind couldn't yet comprehend. One afternoon, together with his four-legged first and truest friend, among the labyrinthine texts and curling margins of indecipherable notes, left to their own devices while the old man napped in his chair, he had run his fingers over brittle pages and pulled a book from the highest shelf he could reach. The cover was plain, unmarked, but the pages within were dense with unfamiliar script and unsettling illustrations. And there he had seen it, the same pattern. It wasn't a drawing in the way the others were, not an intentional depiction of anything known, but something deeper. It wove through the margins, spiraled within the texts, hid itself in the negative spaces between letters. A shape that should not have been, yet was undeniably there. The sight of it made his stomach tighten, an inexplicable fear blooming within him. He had slammed the book shut, shoving it back onto the shelf, and run from the room, never speaking of it, though the sensation had lingered for days, a shadow cast without light. He had dismissed that childhood memory as nothing, his mind playing tricks, an illusion of water and light, but now he knew better. The pattern wasn't new. It had always been there, waiting, its presence masked beneath the noise of life. It was the shape of things left undone, the weight of words never spoken, the slow entropy of a world that mistook movement for progress. The next day he left the office early. The night had given him nothing, not a minute of rest. He stepped out into the city's dim haze, the streets stretching before him like veins beneath ashen skin. He walked without direction, past flickering billboards that promised lives no one could afford, past the glass towers that rose empty, their windows dark like sightless eyes. The people around him moved in careful, detached motions, heads bent over their devices, their faces lit in the blue-white glow. A civilization sleepwalking toward its own vanishing point. For the first time, he saw the pattern in them too. The rhythm of the crosswalk signals, the synchronized shuffle of feet, the identical expressions of dull absorption. They were caught in it, bound by a force unseen yet absolute. It wasn't malevolence that gripped them, not some dark conspiracy, but something worse, the absence of will, the surrender to inertia. Finite, that was the word that came to him. The world, himself, all of it, finite. He thought of the pattern, the Ouroboros, Jomungandr, Wrítros. Or was it rather infinite? The primordial serpent swallowing its own tail, the endless loop. How long had humanity been circling this drain? How many times had civilizations collapsed under their own weight? A terrible clarity settled upon him. The world wasn't only dying environmentally, it was sick in spirit, hollowed from within by its own exhaustion. And the pattern, the shape that shouldn't be, was its hunger, an ancient thing feeding on the slow unraveling of purpose. He saw it in the empty gestures of his colleagues, in the sterile efficiency of automated systems designed to anticipate thought before it could form, in the quiet, ceaseless hum of the city that never truly slept, yet was never truly awake. The serpent didn't only exist in the great spiraling collapses of civilizations. It didn't only lurk in data models and dying ecosystems, in systems that devoured themselves until there was nothing left. It existed in men as well, in their smallest, most private betrayals, in every moment they had known what must be done and had turned away. He stopped walking, stood there on the corner of an unremarkable street, breathing in the heavy air of a world in decline. The realization was both weight and release. He couldn't go on as before. There was no more comfort in the illusion of stability, no more refuge in routine. To remain as he was, to continue submitting reports, to continue watching the numbers descend into inevitability, was to be complicit in his own dissolution. But what did it mean to act? He turned, almost expecting to see some great sign, a burning inscription in the sky, a fissure splitting the concrete beneath his feet. But the world remained as it was, unchanged, indifferent. It wasn't the world that would move first. He couldn't think of anything else. The pattern gnawed at him, invaded the quiet spaces of his mind. He saw it in the curvature of data models, in the folds of discarded paper, in the movements of strangers. It was as if his realization had granted it power, as though awareness alone had sharpened its presence. His thoughts circled back to it relentlessly, never settling, never yielding answers. He hardly slept. His hands shook when he typed reports, when he poured coffee, when he locked the door to his apartment and stood staring at the hallway beyond, uncertain of what he expected to find. At first, he thought the unease was simply exhaustion, the byproduct of staring too long into the abyss of these data and theory. But the feeling deepened. It became something more insidious, a creeping disquiet that settled beneath his skin. Conversations felt disjointed, as if people were reading from an invisible script. The city's silence seemed heavier, pressing in on him like a held breath. The serpent wasn't simply something he had discovered. It was something that had noticed him in return. He stopped answering emails, stopped taking calls. He left messages unread, words untouched, as though engagement itself would pull him further into its web. He walked for hours at night, wandering through streets that seemed subtly changed, corners sharper, lights too dim, spaces stretched just enough to unsettle. And always in the distance, the nagging certainty that he was being watched. Not by eyes, not by people, but by something deeper, something unseen that had held him in its gaze. It became unbearable. The world had split, and he couldn't return to the side he had left. There was no unseeing it, no unknowing. To remain as he was, to continue submitting reports, to continue watching the numbers descend into inevitability, was to be complicit in his own dissolution. The serpent didn't need to devour. It merely waited. It thrived in stillness, in resignation, in the spaces where men abandoned the struggle to be more than what the world demanded of them. It wasn't just entropy, not just the decay of the world. It was a choice, a question asked in silence, waiting for an answer. For the first time in years, he felt something like urgency. But what did it mean to act? He had spent days, perhaps weeks, though time had become unmoored, adrift in some nameless current, trapped between the weight of knowing and the paralysis of action. The pattern haunted him, not as a thing he could point to, not as a shape he could trace with his fingers, but as a presence, a shadow behind the eyes of every passerby, a tremor in the silence between thoughts. It was in the static hum of the street lights, in the perfectly timed hesitation of a pedestrian before crossing, in the way the wind seemed to die in certain places, as if afraid to move too freely. One night, lying awake, the realization struck him, not as a sudden revelation, but as something that had been waiting in the corners of his mind, half seen, half understood. The serpent wasn't a force outside him. It wasn't something lurking in the undercurrents of history, not some external malice imposed upon the world. It was within. It had always been within. He saw it then, in the quiet betrayals of daily life, in the moments he had swallowed his words instead of speaking, in the days he had let slip by without shape or consequence, in the excuses he had made to himself, each one a tightening loop, a coiling thread in a vast and invisible snare. The serpent was there, in the hesitation before reaching out, in the silent acquiescence to inertia, in the fear of being seen, of being known, of being called to something greater than mere existence. And it was not his alone. He saw it in others too now, in the careful scripts they recited, in the way they filled their lives with distractions, rituals performed not out of devotion, but out of dread, anything to keep from asking the question they couldn't bear to answer. What have I become? The world wasn't merely dying in the ways he had always measured, oceans rising, forests collapsing, systems failing under the weight of their own excess. It was sick at its core, sick in its soul. People didn't live, they waited for meaning to arrive, for purpose to announce itself, for something, anything, to tell them that the life they lived was not simply a slow dissolution into nothing. But the serpent thrived in that waiting. It grew fat on it, feeding on the unspent energy of 1 billion lives held in suspension. To fight it wasn't an act of destruction, but an act of release. It was not enough to hate the world's decay, to mourn the entropy that spread through every system, every city, every life. It had to be fought. Not once, not in a single grand gesture, but constantly, ceaselessly, in the small choices of every day. It was the duty of every person to slay the serpent within themselves, to step forward despite the fear, despite the uncertainty, despite the inevitability of failure. There was no path laid out, no voice from above to give instructions. There was only the choice to act or to be devoured, to remain frozen, waiting for permission to live, or to shatter the paralysis with motion, with will. And perhaps that was the final cruelty of it, that no one could be saved by another, that each man, each woman had to confront their own serpent alone, in the quiet moments when no one was watching, that the battle couldn't be avoided, only postponed, and that every delay gave the serpent more ground. But he knew now, and once seen, it couldn't be unseen. The truth was unbearable, yes, but it was also liberating. There was no more waiting, no more hoping for an answer that would never come. There was only the battle. He breathed in, slow and steady. His hands trembled as he sat down. The serpent tightened. This has been part 1 of the Wrítros Algorithm, a modern serpent-slaying myth. You will find part 2 and 3 and many other audiobooks and stories on hamingja.foundation/membership. hamingja.foundation/membership.